Conversations Over Coffee. Today, my guest was supposed to be Rabbi Robin Fryer-Botson, the Associate Rabbi here at Beth Tzedec Congregation in Toronto. Unfortunately, due to some family circumstances, she's not able to be with us today, but we hope to have her back sometime in the near future. But we want to thank Daniel Silverman, who is also a colleague at Beth Tzedec, who is our Education Director and Program Manager, for pinch hitting and joining us at the last minute. So today's conversation, which was supposed to be about rabbis and resiliency and pastoral care, not only for people that are in our community, but also for ourselves, will have to be postponed. Daniel, thanks so much for joining us.
Happy to be here. I'll say that I'm probably best suited as a pinch hitter and pinch hitter only in baseball, and so I'm happy to do the same in this setting.
Well, I hope you're going to bat at least 300 then during this game.
There we go.
First of all, when there may be a lot of people that don't know who you are, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm Daniel. I've been working at Beth Tzedec since the summer of 2012, always with the Director of Education hat and with the duties and responsibilities, all of which have been really instrumental in my own personal and professional growth. One thing that I'll just say that's lovely about working at a large synagogue, Canada's largest synagogue, is you have the opportunity to do different things without having to change employers. I feel very fortunate to have found that place and to have been able to have those opportunities. I grew up in Ottawa. I did my professional schooling after high school in Montreal, including a year in Jerusalem. I spent a little bit of time in Toronto working for Hillel, and then scratched the itch of study at the Seminary in New York, where I completed master's programs in Jewish education and in Tanakh, in Bible. Taught for 1 year at a Jewish high school on Long Island, and then had the opportunity to come back home, and to come back to my wife Rachel's home as well. It's been great, notwithstanding the recent greatness of being in Canada versus other places. But it's always nice to come home. There's a lot of people I know experience whether you're from Toronto or from somewhere else. So that's a little about me.
That I think you're forgetting what I think is one of the most interesting things about you, and that is that you're also a certified tripper, and you used to be a tripper for Camp Ramah.
Yeah, 4 summers taking kids out, some of whom were thrilled to spend 4, 5, 6 days with me, and some of whom were less than thrilled, whether it was on Skeleton Lake at where Camp Ramah in Canada is located, whether it was leading the camping trips into Algonquin Park or Killarney, or on one fortunate occasion up to Temagami, North Bay. It was a wonderful way to spend 4 summers, and you always kind of stop and look around at your other colleagues on tripping staff and say, they're paying us to do this? We would pay to do this. This is what we want to do with our time anyways. So
I'm looking forward to the time when we can do a staff canoe trip, and you can
give me enough time just to get back in shape. So
yeah, right. Well, for all of us, I thought we would start. First and foremost, I think what's on a lot of people's minds is going back to school. Certainly, going back to whatever day school, whatever school people go to. Whether it be a public school or Jewish day school, there's all that concern about that. But one of the things that I know that you've been spending a lot of time thinking about is what is our reopening plan for the congregational school. So why don't you tell us, first talk a little bit about the congregational school, what its goals are, and perhaps it's a pedagogic approach, and then you can talk a little bit more specifically about our reopening plan.
Sure. So I think it's worth pointing out that when the Beth Tzedec building was constructed in the mid-1950s, the first part of the building to be built, I believe, somebody can fact check me, and I'm happy to be corrected, but I believe the first part of the building to be built was the school wing, not any of the prayer spaces. And I think that says a lot about both at the time and up to the current day, more than 60 years later, the priority and focus that our community and all synagogue communities over the generations have put on education, and specifically on education of children. Beth Tzedec had a part-time Hebrew and congregational school program since before Beth Tzedec merged into the congregation it now is. I do just want to point out, since I use different terms, sometimes we talk about Hebrew school, religious school, congregational school. Those are all, generally speaking, the same thing, which means students coming after their Monday to Friday regular full-time school. Sometimes they come in the afternoon, sometimes they come on Sunday, depends on the setting of the congregation, for additional learning focused on Hebrew language and Jewish topics. The language that we've started to use in the industry, and I know in the Toronto Jewish community now, is part-time Jewish education. That's actually more, I think, reflective of what the experience is, the time allocation to it, and putting Jewish education in there as opposed to school, I think does well for the sector. So what we have is for students, our entire community of children grades 7 all the way down to junior kindergarten, we gather together on Sunday mornings for 2.5 hours to engage in Jewish learning of all sorts: prayers, holidays, Hebrew language, mitzvot, ethics, morals, music, Israel, a whole bunch of different things. And then for students in grades 3 through 7, they gather again for an additional hour during the week for focused Hebrew language instruction in small groups of no more than 4 kids per. We've come to learn over the years that second and third language acquisition is hard. It's even harder when you're not engaging with it every day. And it's also harder when you are in larger groups and larger settings. So a few years ago, we broke it down to a focused small group hour, and we've been very happy with that. So that's a little bit about the format and the structure. Our school has vacillated over the last number of years between 55 to 80 kids, and that's who we are.
I think it's important to remember also that one of the reasons why our school is so small is the large number of people at Beth Tzedec who send their kids to day school. So I think you told me once that grades 1 or JK, SK through grade 8, we have something like 60% of our kids are involved in Jewish day school.
Yeah, that's
and
pretty much
that number drops down after grade 8 to like 50%.
A little lower than that, but maybe 40. But even still, right? You look at Beth Tzedec in a synagogue of our size, and someone would be correct to ask the question: why is your part-time Hebrew program, your part-time Jewish education program so small? And that's a big contributor to it. It's also worth mentioning we're open to more than our membership, but given the geography of where the synagogue is vis-a-vis the portion of the Toronto Jewish community that lives around it, it's a day school heavy neighborhood. We also know that
we host a day school at Beth Tzedec.
That's true. And we also, what I was going to say is that geography is king. We'll talk about how that might be changing, but up until March, what really motivated a lot of people's choices was, what did you live near and what were your other driving responsibilities as a parent? And so, you might have somebody who lives 20 kilometers from the synagogue who really likes our part-time program and what we're all about, but it's just not convenient for them to get their kid there on a Sunday morning and then, to go home and have only an hour at home, or to have to kill time in the neighborhood of the synagogue. So those are some of the challenges we have to growing our school, which is both kind of the embedded population of our synagogue being so day school heavy by percentage, and the neighborhood that we're in being so day school heavy.
So what are the ideas that are now coming to the forefront? We're still living in a pandemic world. We're not yet in a post-pandemic world. God willing, that will come. B'mehera v'yameinu. But so now you have a challenge of a pandemic and social distancing and so forth in a part-time educational setting, and also opportunities. So what are some of the thoughts that we're thinking about as to how we might be innovative at this time of disruption and change?
So one thing that was helpful in a way is we had a test run of online learning by necessity. In the middle of March, we made the pivot to online only learning for the remainder of the school year, which for us was about 6 weeks of learning leading up to Pesach, and then a few weeks afterwards dealing with holiday thematics, at least the Israeli national holidays and everything else that we teach. So we were, in a sense, forced into that experiment, not by our own choice, but had the opportunity to experience it, get feedback from our parents, work with our teachers to figure out how to best deliver a curriculum that was designed not for online learning in an online space. It went pretty well. We had, of course, some families for whom on-screen learning was not what was going to work best for their children. But for the most part, we had great participation, not only in terms of attendance, but in terms of actual engagement with the learning, even though things were on the computer. One of the choices we made was to shorten our school day a little bit, knowing that 2.5 hours in front of a screen, especially for kids, is just too much. So we cut that back by about 45 minutes. And it worked to be able to finish the school year, and everybody was, understanding, tolerant of, and in some cases enthusiastic with this new format. Then we had the summer break. We're looking around. We're watching what's happening with public health recommendations, the guidance that's coming out of Sick Kids here in Toronto specifically, seeing what the Jewish day school sector is choosing to do, what the public school sector, even in the last week, has made certain announcements about. And all of that is being overlaid with an understanding that in-person learning, especially for children, most especially for younger kids, JK through grade 2, let's say, is best. And that in-person learning, putting everything else aside, is what we ideally want to do and that we're in the business of doing, not only because it transfers knowledge more effectively, but it builds community much more effectively. To have your friends in boxes on a screen versus to have your friends right in front of you and you're working on collaborating on something physical, they're not even comparable. So our hope, the language I used through most of the summer was our hope is to return to in-person learning, but that was always going to be guided by what public health officials and the synagogue leadership and the experts that we consult with were going to say, and never, ever, ever putting our students and our teachers, and frankly myself too, in undue risk for the sake of in-person learning. As protocols were coming out kind of in the last 2 or 3 weeks, we were looking at that and have basically made a choice that we're going to start the school year together in person. We're going to do so with all the precautions that are present in other schools, be they public schools, non-Jewish private schools, or Jewish day schools, perhaps even enhance some of those precautions beyond what the baseline recommendations are. So those are things like all students up above a certain grade, which will be grade 4, maybe even as young as grade 2, must be masked. All teachers must be masked. Students younger than that will be highly encouraged to be masked. There'll be hand sanitizer in every classroom, hand washing procedures, COVID screenings that everybody has to do Sunday before they show up, dedicated entrance and exit ways, not mixing classes so that we can maintain certain cohorts, all the same sort of things that we've been talking about for other schooling environments. And we're going to give it a go. One thing that we're going to do is we're going to not open the school year in September, but rather wait until October. As it turns out, so many of the Jewish holidays this year are on Sunday that it buys us time.
Yeah, that you weren't doing much before then anyway.
Right. We can wait to open school by 5 weeks and only lose one Sunday.
Right.
So the plan is to do that, and that gives us time to see what happens out there in the world as the public schools reopen right after Labor Day. And if we have to pivot, we'll pivot. And there's 2 ways that we're prepared to pivot. One is right back to fully online learning as we did for the last quarter of the past school year. And the other is to recognize that we might have students who, either because of their own or their family medical situations, aren't comfortable coming in person but still want to learn, or because of potential exposure in other areas might have to be engaging in a period of isolation due to contact tracing and all of that. We're talking about how do we make use of technology to run a blended classroom such that there are some students in the room learning and some of their classmates are online learning. It takes a skill set for an instructor to know how to do that, well. And we've been using the summer to identify who are the right people that we can bring in to be our teachers who can navigate any or all of those possible formats.
Take a look back to your education at JTS for your master's in Jewish education, and the almost decade now that you've worked as a Jewish educator. What are some of the changes that you've seen? What's been surprising? What's of concern?
Mm-hmm. One thing that I think is a big shift that was happening even before I started my schooling, but it's really accelerated, is the focus on socio-emotional learning, understanding, especially in part-time settings, that the transference of knowledge, that getting content from the hands of the teacher to the hands of the student is not the only thing that we are there to do. And in certain moments and settings is in fact the secondary thing that we are there to do. There's an understanding that for a long time, for many decades ago, part-time Jewish education, in fact, and there's research to back this up, in fact, proved detrimental to one's engagement in Jewish life as an adult.
If it was the only means of Jewish education.
Right, but the research basically said that your engagement in Jewish life as an adult, you are more likely to be more highly engaged as a Jewish adult if you had no Jewish education than if you only had part-time Jewish education.
Right.
Which says what it says about the state of the field decades ago. And partly from that research and other things, there was a realization that these opportunities in these settings, when we have such little time and we have to make such difficult decisions about what it is we're going to teach and what it is we're not going to teach, that creating positive associations between the learners and Jewish living and Jewish experiences is actually what's paramount. If we create positive experiences and if we create positive associations, then learners are more likely as they grow to want to engage in more what we'll call content-based learning. It's not to say that we're going to eliminate content the whole way through, but the focus really shifted to start to balance content and socio-emotional learning. And that really, I think, for these times is that much more important, right? We know that we're going to have students walking into our school, whether it's literally or figuratively, in the fall, who are going to need a ton of emotional support to help them process what it is that they've lived through for the last 6 months and counting. And we have the opportunity to help them and their families use Jewish learning and Jewish living and Jewish text and Jewish history as a frame by which to process their emotions and to understand what sort of social experience they're a part of, both in school and in society around them. So that's become a big shift. And it's a shift that's really emerged out of, first and foremost, I would say, the Jewish camping movement and Jewish summer programs for teens, where you have immersive environments. And my colleagues have been working really hard to figure out how do you take a 24/7 immersive camp environment and replicate aspects of it in a 3 or 4 hour a week part-time program.
Now, I wonder, I think that's a really good point that you made. I wonder, should we add to the mix on a monthly basis, perhaps, rabbinic office hours, where, like, one of the rabbis sits at a table or something, if somebody wants to come and just sit down and talk, that we're there to have that opportunity for the kids. Or is that perhaps a little too scary for some kids to think to come and do that? Maybe there's another way to involve us in providing that kind of emotional, spiritual support.
Or maybe it's for their parents.
Or maybe it's for their parents.
I
something we should talk about offline.
For sure.
It also seems to me, you and I share a master's in Jewish education from JTS, although mine's a few years before yours. It seems to me like, that same study that we were talking about before, that if one's only Jewish educational experience is the congregation, that's where it's been detrimental. But when you've paired the supplemental education with either youth group or camp or Jewish camping, very little difference in terms of one's emotional attachment to Judaism compared to day school kids. Obviously, lots of difference in terms of content, More hours, more Hebrew, more Bible is more. But in terms of one's motivation, inspiration, and attachment, it's a congregational school plus something else. It increases exponentially the likelihood that that young person will become a Jewishly engaged adult.
I think what you've identified is the push-pull struggle that specifically synagogues, and more specifically, I would say conservative synagogues, have been trying to work through in the last couple of decades. You know it better than anybody in your previous role as the CEO of USCJ, right? When you have synagogues that, on the one hand, are providing what have been primarily content-based experiences, be it school, be it adult education, be it prayer, and that's what people have been used to. But it's not as sticky. Not for everybody, but on the whole, I would say it's not as sticky as immersive experiences. And how do you take a Shabbat morning service, for example, and make it feel like an immersive experience, while at the same time still ticking the boxes that you want to tick insofar as a synagogue's own, halachic perspective, and also not alienating people who liked it the way it was.
Well, the benefit that large synagogues have is that they don't have to be an either or institution. It can be an and.
It can be an and, but at the same time, are you sacrificing a bit of community feel by breaking up into 2 or 3 minyanim? And then, how do you work to have everybody still feel like, in our example, right, they're Beth Tzedec first and foremost, and I choose to go to this service as opposed to I am a sanctuary service person at Beth Tzedec. And we're working on it. I'm not saying that it's...
Yeah, look, I think ultimately part of Beth Tzedec's brand, quote unquote, is that it provides multiple dynamic opportunities for people to engage. Mm-hmm. That we recognize that some people are going to engage religiously, some people are going to engage culturally, some people are going to engage in terms of education and learning, some people are going to engage in social justice, right? I mean, we have people that are only involved in our refugee sponsorship programs, for example, or out of the cold, and won't be seen coming to shore for Shabbat.
But I just want to translate that analogy back to the education world for a second. What happens if a student comes home from my program in grade 1 or grade 2 and they can't do the Manishana? I usually get a phone call from their parents. How can my kid not have learned the Manishana?
Well, there's a baseline, right? I mean, there is a baseline of a reasonable baseline expectation of know, do, and feel, right? That we want our kids to be able to participate, certainly at the very least, in those critical holiday celebrations, right? So Manishtana, the ability to decode Hebrew at the very least, basic knowledge of holidays and of Israel and so forth. I mean, that's the baseline. But how you offer that and how you get there, I think we have to think more creatively about the mix of cognitive and affective education and experiences.
And the education we're trying to do for parents and grandparents and community members, right, is not to say that not being able to do the Manishana isn't important. But if we're doing all this other learning around Passover as well, that may not be as content focused and might be more narrative focused or whatever else, to recognize that is learning too, and that is learning that is potentially even more life applicable and lifelong. And
I share that frustration, right? That's the frustration of if your educational program, your part-time Jewish educational program is 4 hours a week, grade 3 to grade 7, right? What is that? 3, 4? It's
100 hours a year.
It's 100 hours a year, right? So that's only 500 hours over the course of that entire experience. Mm-hmm. If 500 hours isn't even equal to the equivalent of a full-time kindergarten education.
500 hours, I've done this math. 500 hours is the equivalent amount of content time as a year and a half of the Judaic studies portion of a Jewish day school education.
Yeah.
So spread out over 5 years, 4 hours a week.
Right. So that's the big challenge that you're talking about in terms of part-time education. Right. Part-time education is limited by the fact that it's part-time, and it is best when viewed as supplemental to other meaningful Jewish engagements. Now, they don't have to be day school. I mean, day school certainly I think is important and is highest level, but we also know that day school, when it doesn't have an emotional content or religious content, produces kids that know a lot but don't necessarily do a lot. And so that's why, all of this has got to be holistic in terms of what are the priorities of families and the community, and how do we get more immersive experiences that are affective in their output rather than cognitive. And that's always the challenge. It's the challenge because you're competing in the day school world. You're competing with the fact that they go to school 5 days a week. It's like, that's enough. I'm doing Jewish during the week. During the weekend, I just want to play hockey and so forth and so on. And with the kids and families that are part-time, you're competing with school and with hockey and with other sports and with dance and so forth and so on. And so again,
and you see it for summers too, right? If you're a day school kid and my kid gets this 10 months of the year, I want their summer to be, not having to wake up and do tefillah every morning.
Although I remember once, lahavdil, I remember once as a Roshi died, Camp Ramah, I won't say which one or when, but I had a kid whose parents decided that their kid needed a summer vacation from their lithium. I'm just like, there's just I don't understand why we think that there's some things you could take a summer vacation from. It's like, I need a summer vacation from being moral. So it's like, I'm just going to go and do this. These are the real challenges that we have. And I think that what we're certainly working towards, as because you and I talk about this all the time, is how do we create more retreat-based kinds of learning opportunities, and to think creatively now, especially about the use of technology and hybrid models between people in school, people not in school, so forth and so on. And the benefit of a place like Beth Tzedec is that when we're ready to start experimenting in this, we will have the capacity to do so because we have the staff and the resources to do that. So it's going to be, for right now, I think the goal is let's get through to Hanukkah. Right? Let's get the whole synagogue through to Hanukkah, catch our breath, see where we are as a result of this pandemic, and at the same time start paying attention to what are the opportunities that we see that are developing as we're moving through this. I think we have, time for, one last thought, Daniel.
Look, what I'll say is, I'm living this from the other side too. I have a 6-year-old daughter, a 3-year-old son, one more on the way in mid-November. Our daughter is in the Jewish day school system. Our son is about to start nursery in the Jewish day school system and had been in the kind of daycare system before that. I am extraordinarily fortunate that both my wife and I have remained, employed through this period of time, which also presents other challenges vis-a-vis childcare and being able to balance everything that's going on in our life. And so when I talk to parents in my program or who are considering the congregational school at Beth Tzedec, I think I'm right there with them. In that sense, which is comforting to me. I don't know how it feels to them, but it's certainly comforting to me. I'm not only with these choices of, do we send our children back to school in September, which we're planning on doing? What does that mean insofar as then are we limiting their and our exposure to other people and grandparents and these sorts of things? How is that going to relate to what is my busiest time of year, right when they go back to school, shortly before us having a new baby? There are many challenges no matter what, and then when you throw what we're living through into the mix, it's a lot. And to recognize that everybody is dealing with these stresses, and parents of younger children exceptionally so, not exclusively so, but exceptionally so.
But I just
I'm right there with so many other people who, whether they're watching this now or later, or who we deal with in the synagogue. It's hard, and it's supposed to be hard. And to
Danielle, I need to cut you off because there's a question I think that's important
sure.
that you should take that came from Facebook.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, what are students curious about in their Jewish education?
I think it's a lot of different things. And I think it partly depends on the kid themselves. If you're curious about music, you'll be curious about Jewish music. There's a lot of curiosity about Israel, especially because we have brought Shinshinim, Israeli young emissaries, real live young Israelis into our program to be able to present and be a face of Israel to our students. For some, there's curiosity about tefillah, especially if it's something that they're familiar with in being in a synagogue space, but not familiar enough with to really know the flow of a service and those sorts of things. For some, there's familiarity with Hebrew because they're language kids, or because it goes the other way, or because it's ancient. There's curiosity with artifacts sometimes. So the approach we like to take in the industry is called a child-centered approach, is to, as best you can while still having some sort of framework and curriculum guiding your plans, meet the kids where they're at, find out what piques their interest, what makes them excited, and work to foster that and nurture that.
Thank you, Danielle. I think you hit it out of the ballpark today. So thanks for pinch hitting for Rabbi Fryer Batson. This is a very important conversation, one that we should come back to in the future about the part-time Jewish education of our children, for which there are hundreds of kids in our community that this is their primary means of at least formal Jewish education.
And opportunity as well, I'll say.
And opportunities. I want to just let everyone know that next week, my guests are going to be Yossi Abramowitz, who is a Covenant Foundation winner. Years ago, he was recognized for being an outstanding Jewish educator, including the publication of a newsletter that you might remember called Baba Ganuz. He made Aliyah with his wife, Rabbi Sarah Silverman. Susan Silverman. Sarah is her sister, actually, the comedian. That's why I always get confused. And Yossi and Susan will be my guests. Yossi is he is the guru of Israel's solar energy. He and his partners out of Kibbutz Keturah have now put the Arava region of Israel, the south of Israel, is 100% during daytime hours on solar energy. He has a plan for all of Israel to be like that. And more than that, he and his partners are exporting Israel's solar technology to Africa and providing significant portions of energy to some of the poorer countries and regions of the world. And Susan, in her own right as a rabbi and an advocate, the two of them, they've adopted several children as well as have had biological children. But Susan has started a program to help synagogues support fostering and adopting of children in our communities. A very, very fascinating conversation with really a terrific married couple that in their own ways and collectively are doing fabulous things to change the world. So I hope you'll join us for that. That's next week, 12:30. For everything that's going on at Beth Tzedec, Beth Tzedec All Access, www.beth-tzedec.org. Join us for community and for relationships. The building may be closed, synagogues wide open. We practice physical distance and spiritual nearness, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks, everyone.